I am Ethan, and I am 28 years old. For over 10 brutal, exhausting years, I poured my blood, sweat, and absolute sanity into building my family's distribution empire from the ground up, only to be thrown out onto the street so my golden boy older brother could take the throne. When I stood in that corporate boardroom, watching my life's work being handed over to a man who did not know the first thing about running a business, I asked my father what was supposed to happen to my career. He looked me dead in the eyes, right in front of the entire executive team, and said, "Walk away if you do not like it." They practically laughed me out of the building. But there is one massive detail they did not know. I built the very digital infrastructure they relied on, and I had access to a hidden paper trail proving they were laundering hundreds of thousands of dollars through offshore shell companies. And right now, the arrogant man who told me to walk away is leaving me sobbing voicemails, begging me to save him from federal prison. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled their empire piece by piece, hit that like button if you believe that karma always comes to collect its debts. And please drop a comment letting me know where you are watching from tonight. Now let me take you back to where this nightmare really started. It was exactly 2 in the morning on a freezing Tuesday when my phone started vibrating against the cheap laminate wood of my nightstand. I am a very light sleeper, always have been. It is a leftover survival habit from years of managing overnight logistics for my family's company. For a decade, my brain was wired to wake up at the slightest buzz, waiting for emergency calls about broken-down freight trucks on the interstate or delayed shipments at the loading docks. But I did not work for them anymore. I had not spoken a single word to my father, Richard, or my brother Julian in exactly 3 weeks. The screen glowed in the pitch-black room, illuminating the stark, empty walls of my cramped, month-to-month rental apartment. It was a massive downgrade from the spacious condo I used to rent near the corporate office, but this place was mine. It was untainted. The caller ID flashed my father's name. I just laid there on the thin mattress, staring at it, watching the phone vibrate violently until it finally stopped. The silence in the room returned, heavy and almost suffocating. 30 seconds later, it buzzed again, then a third time. Then a text notification popped up, immediately followed by a voicemail alert. I sat up, the cold night air biting at my bare shoulders. I reached over, unlocked the bright screen, and hit play on the voicemail. I did not expect an apology. My father was not a man who ever apologized. He was a man who commanded rooms, who demanded absolute loyalty, who expected the entire world to bend to his specific will. But the voice that came through the small phone speaker did not sound like the ruthless, untouchable CEO I knew. It sounded fractured. It sounded completely terrified. Ethan, it is your dad. I need you to pick up the phone right now. Please. Things are falling apart over here. Julian made some terrible calls with the real estate leases, and the primary vendors are threatening a massive lawsuit by Friday. We are hemorrhaging money. The board is asking questions I cannot answer. I know you are angry, but I need your help. You are the only one who understands the back-end systems. Please call me back. Help. He actually used the word help. I played the message a second time, sitting perfectly still, letting the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of it wash over me. The man who had officially erased me from his legacy, who had systematically dismantled my self-worth for 28 years, was now crying into his phone because his chosen heir was running the ship straight into a concrete wall. I did not feel a sudden rush of triumph. I did not feel the cinematic vindication you see in the movies. I just felt an overwhelming hollow exhaustion deep in my bones. As I sat there in the dark, the phone lit up again. This time, it was my mother, Victoria. Seeing her name flash on the screen did something entirely different to my chest. Tightened my breathing. It made my jaw clench. My mother was the ultimate peacemaker of the Blackwood family, or at least that was the role she masterfully played for the public. She was the one who smoothed over the cracks, who always asked me to be the bigger person, who weaponized my loyalty under the guise of family harmony. If my father was the heavy hammer, my mother was the velvet glove that smothered you into silent submission. I hovered my thumb over the green accept button, a tiny, pathetic part of the old Ethan. The desperate son who just wanted his parents to love him screamed at me to answer it, to rush in, fix the broken leases, calm the vendors, and save the day. To finally prove my worth so they would look at me and say I mattered. But the new Ethan, the man who had lost everything and survived the fall, took over. I pressed the power button, held it down, and watched the screen turn black as the phone powered off completely. I tossed the dead piece of metal onto the foot of the bed and walked into the tiny kitchen to pour myself a glass of tap water. I leaned heavily against the cheap counter, looking out the window at the empty suburban street below. The streetlights flickered, casting long, distorted shadows on the wet pavement. The silence of the apartment wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. And for the first time in my entire life, I felt entirely safe. I had built a massive fortress of distance between myself and the Blackwood family, and I was not about to lower the drawbridge just because their house of cards was collapsing. You see, this was never just about a family business dispute or a stolen corporate promotion. This was about a lifetime of being told I was second best. It was about a deeply ingrained toxic favoritism that infected every Thanksgiving dinner, every holiday, every single milestone I ever achieved. To fully understand why I walked away that day in the boardroom and why I eventually decided to strike the match that burned their fraudulent empire to the ground, you have to understand how the rot started. You have to understand what it is actually like to grow up as the invisible son in a house that worships a false idol. If you asked my parents at a neighborhood block party or one of their pretentious HOA meetings, they would look you dead in the eye and swear on a stack of Bibles that they loved both their sons equally. They would proudly talk about how they provided a beautiful, sprawling home in the wealthy suburbs, how we never went hungry, how we had every possible opportunity to succeed in life. And from the outside, looking at the perfectly manicured lawns and the luxury cars parked in the pristine driveway, you might actually believe them. But the reality inside those walls was a completely different, much darker story. My brother Julian is 2 years older than me. From the exact moment he could walk and talk, he was the undisputed center of their universe. He was the classic golden child. He was charismatic, loud, athletically gifted, and effortlessly charming. He played varsity football, he dated the prom queen, and he knew exactly how to flash a $1 million smile to get whatever he wanted from anyone. I, on the other hand, was the quiet one. I liked numbers. I liked building systems. I liked figuring out how complex things worked. I did not demand the spotlight, so I rarely received even a sliver of it. The disparity started in small, insidious ways that chip away at a child's soul. When we were young, household chores were mysteriously delegated, so that I was always doing the grueling heavy lifting, while Julian casually supervised. I remember being 14 years old and spending my entire summer sweating under the blistering July sun, pushing a heavy, rusted lawnmower around the neighborhood to save up money. I desperately wanted to buy a second-hand laptop from a dingy pawn shop downtown so I could teach myself basic coding. It took me 3 agonizing months of blistered hands and sunburns to save $300. When I finally brought that beat-up, clunky machine home, I was incredibly proud. I felt like I had conquered the world with my own 2 hands. A week later, Julian walked into my bedroom and casually said he needed to borrow it to finish a high school history project. I told him no. I was using it to run a tutorial. He did not argue. He did not yell. He just waited until I went to school the next morning, walked into my room, took the laptop, and never gave it back. When I finally confronted him days later, he laughed right in my face and told me I was being ridiculously selfish, claiming his grades mattered more for his upcoming college applications. I went straight to my father, expecting him to enforce some basic fundamental rule of fairness. Instead, my dad barely looked up from his financial newspaper. He told me that Julian had a very big future ahead of him and that I needed to stop whining over a piece of junk. He looked at me coldly and said, "It is all in the family, right? Do not be so stingy with your brother." That was the defining, unspoken rule of the Blackwood household. Everything that was mine was actually Julian's, and everything that was Julian's was strictly his. It only got exponentially worse as we got older. When Julian graduated high school, my parents liquidated a portion of their 401k and dipped heavily into their retirement savings to send him to a prestigious, ridiculously expensive private university out of state. They even bought him a brand new SUV as a going-away present. 2 years later, when it was my turn to look at colleges, the conversation was violently different. We sat around the dining table after a massive Thanksgiving dinner, and my father bluntly announced that the college fund was completely tapped out. He told me without a hint of remorse that I would need to take out federal student loans and go to the local state school. My mother reached across the table, patted my hand gently, and gave me her classic, sickeningly sweet smile. She told me that I was always the responsible one, the practical one, and that building character through hard manual work would be good for my development. So I did what I always did. I swallowed the bitter pill and went to work. I took out the massive loans. I worked 2 exhausting part-time night shifts at a local Walmart, and I graduated at the absolute top of my class with a degree in supply chain management. Meanwhile, Julian spent 5 years partying his way through his generic business degree, racking up massive credit card debt that my parents quietly paid off behind my back. After graduation, I moved back home for a few years to help my dad modernize his distribution company. It was a mid-sized operation, moving freight and managing inventory for regional retail chains. It was profitable, but the internal systems were stuck in the Stone Age. They were tracking millions of dollars of inventory on fragile paper ledgers and outdated crashing spreadsheets. I worked brutal 60-hour weeks. I built a custom digital inventory management software from scratch, overhauled their bloated vendor contracts, and streamlined the entire warehouse operations floor. I was at the office by 6 in the morning and rarely left before 8 at night. The only person who ever witnessed my sheer dedication was Bob, the elderly security guard who locked the iron gates behind me every single night. Bob used to hand me a cup of terrible break room coffee and tell me I was the hardest working kid he had ever met. It was profoundly sad that a minimum wage security guard gave me more validation and respect than my own flesh and blood. About a year after I revolutionized the company's logistics and boosted their profit margins by 20%, Julian came back home. He had bounced around a few entry-level corporate jobs in the city and hated all of them because they expected him to actually produce results. He told my parents he wanted to return to his roots and help build the family legacy. My father was overjoyed. He threw a lavish dinner to celebrate. The very next Monday, he gave Julian an executive title, a massive salary that dwarfed mine, and a pristine corner office with a skyline view. My title remained operations manager, and my salary was an absolute joke compared to what Julian was making just to sit in his expensive chair and play golf with clients. I tried to ignore the blatant disrespect. I kept telling myself that the work would ultimately speak for itself, but the final nail in the coffin was rapidly approaching. I kept my head down and focused on the data. I believed that eventually my father would look at the quarterly profit reports and realize who was actually keeping the lights on. But the ultimate betrayal happened during a massive, high-stakes negotiation with a major real estate development vendor. I had spent 6 grueling months courting this specific client. I flew out to their construction sites, analyzed their complex supply chain bottlenecks, and drafted a bulletproof logistical proposal that would increase our company's overall revenue by 30%. I did all the heavy lifting. I built the presentations. I ran the numbers. I answered their late-night emails. The day before the final contract signing, Julian swooped in like a vulture. He took the client's executives out for a lavish steak dinner on the company card, slapped them on the back, poured them expensive scotch, and essentially took full credit for the entire logistical model I had built. The next morning, my father sent out a company-wide email congratulating Julian on closing the biggest financial deal of the decade. My name was not even mentioned in the footnotes. It was as if I did not exist. I snapped. The years of repressed anger boiled over. I stormed down the hallway, pushed open the door to Julian's corner office, slammed it shut behind me, and demanded an explanation. Julian just leaned back in his expensive leather chair, put his expensive Italian shoes up on the mahogany desk, and smirked at me. He told me to relax, claiming it was a team effort, and blatantly stated that I lacked the executive presence and charisma to close high-ticket clients. Before I could reach across the desk and tear him apart, the office door clicked open and my mother walked in. She had stopped by the office to bring Julian a homemade lunch. She saw my red face, saw Julian's smug expression, and immediately went into crisis management mode. She grabbed my arm tightly and pulled me out into the hallway. I will never forget the overwhelming smell of her expensive floral perfume, or the absolute coldness in her eyes masquerading as maternal concern. She looked at me, sighed heavily, as if I was a massive burden, and said, "Ethan, why do you always have to make things so incredibly difficult? Your brother needs this big win for his confidence. You are so smart. You can always go out and get another client. Please, just let him have this one. Do it for the family. Do it for me." That was the exact moment something inside my chest permanently broke. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized the horrifying truth I had been denying my whole life. She was not a peacemaker. She was a dedicated enabler. She was a master manipulator who actively sacrificed my mental health, my career, and my future to pave an easy, frictionless road for her favorite son. I pulled my arm out of her grasp violently. I did not say a single word. I just turned around and walked back to my windowless office. I knew right then that I had to leave. I just did not know my father was about to force me out before I could write my resignation letter. 2 weeks after the stolen real estate client incident, the storm finally hit its peak. I was in the middle of running a complex stress test on our holiday logistics algorithms when my desk phone rang. It was my father's secretary telling me my presence was required in the main corporate boardroom immediately. I assumed it was a standard strategy meeting. I grabbed my tablet, adjusted my tie, and walked down the long carpeted executive hallway. When I pushed open the heavy oak doors, the atmosphere in the room was instantly suffocating. My father sat at the head of the massive mahogany table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. Julian was sitting directly to his right, wearing a smug, barely contained grin. 5 other senior executives and board members were seated around the table, their faces completely unreadable, staring at their notepads. I took the only empty seat left. Right at the opposite end of the long table, I felt like I was walking into a firing squad. My father cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses. He did not even look at me when he started speaking. He looked directly at the executives. He announced that as he was getting older, it was time to start officially transitioning the leadership of the Blackwood Company. He talked grandly about legacy, about aggressive corporate expansion, about needing a charismatic face to lead the name into the next generation. And then he dropped the bomb. He was officially stepping up to chairman of the board, and Julian was being promoted to chief executive officer, effective immediately. The executives clapped politely. Julian stood up, buttoning his tailored suit jacket, and gave a sickeningly humble speech about honoring our father's grand vision. I sat there completely paralyzed, gripping the edges of the table. Julian, the man who could not even read a basic profit and loss statement without asking me to highlight the important numbers in yellow, he was going to be my boss. When the polite applause died down, the large room grew dead quiet. I realized my father was finally looking at me. His eyes were cold, calculating, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. I placed my hands flat on the mahogany table, forcing them to stop shaking. So I said, my voice dangerously quiet but echoing in the silent room, "Julian is the CEO. What exactly is my role going forward? What happens to the operations department and my salary?" Julian chuckled, a deeply patronizing sound that made my blood boil. Well, Ethan, we appreciate your hard work down in the trenches, but as we pivot toward higher-level corporate acquisitions, your role is going to be restructured. You will report directly to my new VP of Strategy. We are actually bringing in an outside corporate consultant to oversee your department. They were officially demoting me. They were bringing in a stranger to manage the exact systems I built from scratch and forcing me to report to Julian's hired cronies. I looked past Julian, locking eyes with my father. I wanted him to see the profound betrayal tearing me apart. I wanted him to justify it. I built this digital infrastructure, I said, my voice rising slightly. I saved this company from bankruptcy 3 years ago by modernizing the supply chain. You know for a fact he has no idea how any of it works. My father's face hardened into a mask of pure fury. He slammed his flat palm violently against the table, a sharp crack that made 2 of the executives jump. "Do not disrespect your brother in this room," he snarled. "This is a corporate decision, not a petty family dispute. Julian has the vision. You are merely a technician. You are free to stay in your new capacity. But if you do not like the direction we are going," he paused, his eyes narrowing into dark slits, "walk away if you do not like it." Walk away? He said it with such casual ease, discarding 10 years of my fierce loyalty, 10 years of my sacrifice like a piece of garbage. He wanted me to quit so he would not have to pay a severance package. He wanted me gone so Julian would not have a constant walking reminder of his own incompetence staring him in the face every single day. I didn't yell. I didn't flip the mahogany table. I didn't give them the satisfaction of an emotional breakdown. I stood up slowly, picked up my tablet, and looked my father right in the eye. "All right," I said. "I am walking." I turned around and walked straight out of the boardroom. I went to my office, grabbed a cardboard box, and packed only my personal items. A framed photo of my dog, my lucky coffee mug, my favorite pens. I left all the complex company manuals, the external hard drives, the planning documents sitting right on the desk. Let Julian figure it out. As I walked out of the building, the sun was just starting to set. Bob, the security guard, was at the front desk. He looked at my box, then up at my face. He didn't ask any questions. He just stood up and held the heavy glass door open for me. "Good luck, kid," he said quietly. That was the only real goodbye I got. I drove out of the state that very night. I did not tell anyone where I was going. I rented a cheap apartment 3 states away, changed my phone number, and spent the first 2 weeks existing in a state of numb exhaustion. I thought I had cut the cord. I thought the worst of the betrayal was over. I was so incredibly wrong. In the 3rd week of my absolute exile, my new prepaid phone rang. It was Sarah, the lead accountant from the family business. She was a sharp, non-nonsense woman in her late 50s who had always treated me with respect. I had secretly given her my new number before I left, strictly for emergencies. "Ethan," she whispered, sounding completely out of breath. "I am calling you from my car in the parking garage. I cannot talk long, but you need to know what your brother is doing." I gripped the phone tightly. "What is he doing, Sarah?" "He is destroying your professional reputation," she said, her voice shaking with indignation. "The transition has been an absolute disaster. Julian does not know how to run the automated vendor portals. Major shipments are missing. Massive invoices are bouncing. The board of directors is furious. And Julian is blaming everything on you." My stomach dropped to the floor. "What do you mean?" "He held an emergency board meeting yesterday. He told the executives that you threw a massive tantrum and intentionally sabotaged the routing algorithms before you quit. He said you maliciously deleted vital vendor contacts. He is framing you for his sheer incompetence, Ethan. And worse, he found the 5-year logistics expansion model you were working on, the one targeting the new e-commerce sector. He presented it to the board this morning and claimed he wrote it entirely by himself. He is passing off your genius as his own to save his job." A cold, heavy, terrifying silence fell over me. They didn't just want me gone from the building, they wanted me ruined. They were perfectly willing to drag my name through the mud to ensure I could never get hired in this industry again, just to protect Julian's fragile, inflated ego. And my father was sitting there letting it happen. "Thank you for telling me, Sarah," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. "Keep your head down. Do not let them know we spoke." I hung up the phone and walked over to the cheap laminate kitchen table. I sat down, pulled out a blank spiral notebook, and grabbed a pen. The sadness, the heavy grief, the desperate need for my parents' validation, it all evaporated into the air in that exact moment. It burned away, leaving absolutely nothing but cold, hardened steel in my chest. I wrote 3 words on the first page of that notebook, pressing the pen so hard it tore through the paper. Build, don't beg. They wanted to steal my work and blame me for their failures. Fine. Let them try to pilot a commercial jet without knowing how to read the dashboard. I wasn't going to sit in the dark and cry over a lost inheritance anymore. I was going to build my own empire. And when their plane inevitably crashed into the mountain, I was going to make sure the black box recorded every single one of their sins. The very next morning, I officially registered the LLC for Apex Logistics. I didn't have millions of dollars in venture capital. I didn't have a fancy corner office or a corporate expense account. What I had was a brain that understood supply chain mechanics better than anyone else on the Eastern Seaboard and a burning, obsessive drive to succeed. I converted my tiny living room into a command center. I bought 3 cheap monitors off a local marketplace app and worked 18-hour days. I started cold calling mid-sized retail brands, offering them a streamlined fulfillment service that guaranteed to cut their overhead by 20%. For the first 2 months, it was brutal. I ate cheap instant noodles and barely slept. But then my first major breakthrough happened. My phone rang, and the caller ID showed the name Marcus. Marcus was the CEO of the massive real estate development firm, the exact same client Julian had stolen from me right before I was fired. I answered cautiously. "Marcus, to what do I owe the pleasure?" Marcus let out a loud, deeply frustrated groan on the other end of the line. "Ethan, thank God I finally found you. I had to bribe one of your old warehouse managers just to get this number. Your brother is a complete and utter disaster. He misses crucial deadlines. He talks in circles during meetings. And he has the sheer arrogance of a guy who was born on third base and genuinely thinks he hit a triple. I am officially breaking my contract with Blackwood Distribution. Are you building something new? Because if you are, I want in immediately." I smiled, a slow, predatory grin spreading across my face in the empty apartment. "I am Marcus, and I can handle your entire portfolio by the end of the month." Landing Marcus's massive account was the catalyst I needed. With his financial backing, I secured a lease on a massive commercial warehouse on the outskirts of the city. I hired my first employee, a brilliant, hungry logistics coordinator named Liam, who had been laid off by a ruthless corporate merger. Liam was exactly the kind of loyal, hard-working guy my father always overlooked. We built the Apex warehouse from the ground up. Within 6 months, we were moving more freight than my family's company had moved in a year. I was thriving. I was finally breathing free air. But I never stopped keeping tabs on the Blackwoods. I knew the crash was coming, but I needed to know exactly how bad it was. That is when I stumbled upon the smoking gun that would change everything. During my time at the family company, I was the one who personally set up their enterprise cloud architecture. When they fired me, Julian's incompetent IT guys revoked my corporate email and locked me out of the primary servers. But they were incredibly sloppy. They forgot about an old legacy administrative folder hidden deep in the directory tied to an old developer key I had created years ago. Late one night, out of pure curiosity, I logged in. The access was still completely active. I started digging through the finance subfolders, looking for proof of Julian's incompetence to show Marcus. What I found was infinitely worse than incompetence. It was a massive, coordinated federal crime. I found a hidden folder labeled Contractor Disbursements. Inside were hundreds of PDF invoices paid out to 3 separate LLCs: Crescent Holdings, Vanguard Solutions, and Apex Consulting. He even stole the word Apex, the unoriginal hack. I cross-referenced the vendor IDs. These companies provided 0 physical services. There were no shipping manifests, no service logs, nothing. They were phantom companies. But what made my blood turn to ice were the routing numbers. The money was being funneled directly into offshore trust accounts in the Cayman Islands. I downloaded absolutely everything. I needed a professional to verify what I was looking at. I called Chloe, a sharp, deeply cynical financial analyst I had gone to college with. She owed me a massive favor from our university days. I sent her the encrypted files and told her to follow the money trail. 2 days later, Chloe called me. Her voice was dead serious. "Ethan, this isn't just skimming a few bucks off the top. This is massive corporate fraud. Whoever is running these shell companies has systematically siphoned almost $600,000 out of Blackwood Distribution over the last 14 months. "Julian," I said, my jaw tight. "He is bleeding his own company dry. It is a massive lawsuit waiting to happen." "It gets worse," Chloe said, the rapid clicking of her keyboard echoing over the phone. "I traced one of the recent disbursements. $50,000 routed through Crescent Holdings last month. The funds were immediately wired back to a domestic account used for a wire transfer to a luxury car dealership in Miami. Someone bought a custom Porsche 911 in cash using stolen corporate funds disguised as a contractor fee." A Porsche. Julian bought a luxury Porsche while the company was failing to pay its legitimate vendors. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. The sheer breathtaking audacity of it. "Chloe," I asked quietly, my heart pounding in my chest, "who signed the authorization forms for these phantom transfers? Are Julian's initials on them?" Chloe was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was soft, laced with profound pity. "Julian's signature is on the transfer requests, Ethan, but he doesn't have the corporate clearance for offshore wires of this magnitude. Every single one of these invoices was countersigned by your father, Richard Blackwood." The room started to spin. My father, the man who ruthlessly lectured me about integrity, about earning an honest dollar, about unyielding loyalty to the family. He wasn't just turning a blind eye to Julian's incompetence. He was actively participating in the embezzlement. He was robbing his own shareholders, his own hard-working employees, to fund his golden child's lavish lifestyle. Suddenly, my firing made perfect sense. I wasn't pushed out just because Julian wanted the CEO title. I was pushed out because I was the only person in the building smart enough to catch them stealing. I was a massive threat to their criminal enterprise. I thanked Chloe, hung up the phone, and looked at the thick stack of printed documents on my desk. I had the bank routing numbers. I had the IP addresses. I had the exact signatures. I held a nuclear bomb in my hands. The only question was when to detonate it. I didn't want to just send an anonymous tip to the police. No, that was way too easy. I wanted to look them dead in the eye when the walls came crashing down. I wanted to see the exact moment they realized the son they threw away was the architect of their destruction. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus. "Marcus," I said, my voice steady and cold as ice, "you still hold a minority shareholder seat on the Blackwood Board of Directors, don't you?" "Unfortunately, yes," Marcus grumbled. "I'm trying to sell my shares, but the company value is completely tanking." "Do not sell them yet," I told him. "I need you to call an emergency board meeting for this Friday. Demand full attendance. Richard, Julian, the whole executive team." "Why? What exactly are you planning, Ethan?" I looked at the printed invoice with my father's signature on it. "I am coming home, Marcus, and I am bringing a match." "I am coming home, Marcus," I said into the phone, staring at the printed financial documents scattered across my cheap kitchen table. "And I am bringing a match." Marcus did not ask any more questions. He was a veteran of the real estate industry, a man who survived corporate bloodbaths by knowing exactly when to step back and let the wolves tear each other apart. He promised me he would leverage his shares to force an emergency board meeting for Friday morning at 9 sharp. He would demand that every single executive, including my father and my brother, be present in that room. He would not tell them why. He would only tell them that a major shareholder was threatening a massive lawsuit if the company's financial bleeding was not immediately addressed. That gave me exactly 4 days to prepare my weapon. I did not need a lawyer to draft a threatening letter. I did not need to scream or shout or beg for my dignity back. I needed undeniable, cold, hard facts. I spent the next 72 hours working exclusively with Chloe, digging through the digital trash Julian had carelessly left behind. We compiled everything. Every offshore wire transfer, every fake invoice from the shell companies, every email where Julian demanded expedited payments to the Cayman Islands. We printed it all out and organized it into 6 identical heavy black binders. But I knew Julian. I knew my father. They were cornered rats, and cornered rats are incredibly dangerous. If they had even a single second to prepare a defense, they would find a way to spin this. They would manipulate the board, destroy the digital evidence, or try to pin the embezzlement on a lower-level employee. I needed them to walk into that boardroom completely blind. I needed them to be suffocated by their own arrogance. And that is when Elena called me. Elena used to be my administrative assistant back at Blackwood Distribution. When I was pushed out, Julian instantly gave her a massive promotion, doubling her salary to keep her loyal to his new regime. She was ambitious, cutthroat, and completely untrustworthy. When my phone lit up with her name on Thursday afternoon, just 18 hours before the board meeting, I knew exactly what was happening. Julian was panicking about the emergency meeting. He was sending out his spies to figure out where the attack was coming from. I let it ring 3 times before I answered, making sure my voice sounded tired and defeated. "Hello, Elena." "Ethan, oh my goodness. It is so great to hear your voice," she chirped, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. "I know things ended terribly when you left, but I just wanted to check in. How are you holding up?" "I am surviving, Elena," I lied smoothly, staring directly at the 6 black binders of federal evidence sitting on my desk. "Just barely, but I am surviving." "That is so good to hear. Actually, the reason I am calling, Julian mentioned there is a huge board meeting tomorrow and Marcus is threatening a lawsuit. Julian is so stressed. He actually thought maybe you were talking to Marcus, trying to sue the company for your unpaid salary or your lost promotion. I told him no way. Ethan is too classy for that. But I just had to ask, are you planning something, Ethan? There it was, the clumsy, desperate fishing expedition. I leaned back in my chair and smiled. I needed to feed her exactly what Julian wanted to hear. I needed him to think I was a pathetic, harmless nuisance. "Elena, please don't tell Julian I said this," I whispered, injecting a heavy dose of fake desperation into my voice. "But yes, I spoke to Marcus. I am completely broke. I cannot even afford a decent lawyer. I told Marcus I wanted to sue my father for the salary he owes me and maybe try to force a tiny settlement so I can pay my rent. But I don't have any real proof of anything. I don't have any documents. Marcus told me I was wasting my time. I am at the end of my rope." Elena let out a soft, highly theatrical gasp. "Oh, Ethan, I am so sorry. That is awful. I promise I won't tell Julian. You just focus on getting back on your feet." She hung up the phone. I knew for an absolute fact she was sprinting down the hallway to Julian's corner office at that very moment. She was going to tell him that his little brother was broke, desperate, completely unarmed, and trying to scrape together a pathetic lawsuit over unpaid wages. Julian would laugh. My father would roll his eyes. They would walk into that board meeting on Friday morning thinking the biggest threat they faced was a disgruntled former employee whining about fairness. They would lower their shields. The trap was perfectly set. Friday morning arrived. The sky over the city was overcast, a heavy, dark gray that threatened rain. I put on a tailored charcoal gray suit I had bought specifically for this day. I did not want to look like the exhausted, overworked operations manager they remembered. I wanted to look like an executioner. I loaded the 6 heavy binders into the trunk of my car and drove toward the corporate headquarters of Blackwood Distribution. The drive felt entirely surreal. I drove past the same coffee shops I used to visit at dawn, past the same highway exits I took when I was working myself to the bone to build their wealth. I thought about the college fund my father claimed was empty. I thought about the decades of emotional neglect. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white, letting the cold anger anchor me. When I pulled into the executive parking lot, I parked right next to the reserved spot for the CEO. Sitting in that spot was a gleaming, brand-new custom silver Porsche 911, the exact car Chloe had tracked through the offshore wire transfers. The sheer arrogance of parking the physical evidence of a federal crime right outside the front door was staggering. I stared at it for a long moment, feeling a dark, icy calm wash over me. I walked up to the heavy glass doors of the main lobby. Bob, the elderly security guard, was sitting behind the front desk sipping his coffee. When he looked up and saw me, his eyes went wide. He stood up slowly, looking at my expensive suit and the heavy leather briefcase in my hand. "Ethan," Bob whispered, looking around nervously to see if anyone was watching. "Kid, what are you doing here? You know you are permanently banned from the building. If Julian sees you—" "Bob," I said softly, giving him a genuine smile. "It is going to be a very strange day. Just buzz me through. I am here as an official guest of Marcus, the majority shareholder." Bob hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then a slow, knowing smile spread across his wrinkled face. He reached under the desk and pressed the heavy buzzer. The electronic lock clicked open. "Give 'em hell, kid," he muttered. I walked through the lobby and stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the top floor. My heart was beating in a slow, steady, powerful rhythm. I was not the terrified son anymore. I was not the invisible brother begging for scraps of affection. I was the architect of their ruin. The elevator doors slid open to the executive suite. The hallway was dead quiet. The emergency board meeting had already started. I walked past the receptionist's empty desk, my leather shoes completely silent on the thick carpet. I approached the heavy frosted glass doors of the main boardroom. Through the glass, I could hear Julian's voice. He sounded incredibly confident, almost bored. "Listen, gentlemen," Julian was saying smoothly. "I know the quarterly numbers look a little soft, but Marcus is overreacting. We are simply navigating a complex transitional period. My brother Ethan left our digital infrastructure in an absolute mess when he threw his little tantrum and quit. We are spending capital to fix his mistakes. That is all." I pushed the heavy oak doors open. They swung wide with a loud, echoing creak. Every single head in the room snapped toward the entrance. There were 8 people sitting around the massive mahogany table. My father, Richard, was at the head. Julian was to his right. Marcus was sitting on the left, his arms crossed over his chest. Derek, a loyalist board member who worshipped my father, was sitting near the end. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was thick, heavy, and suffocating. Julian's smug smile froze on his face. My father's eyes widened in genuine shock, the color rapidly draining from his cheeks. He looked like he had just seen a ghost walk out of a grave. "What the hell is this?" Derek demanded, standing up and pointing a trembling finger at me. "Security! Who let him in the building?" "Richard, your son has no business being here. He is not an employee. He is a security risk." "Sit down, Derek," Marcus said, his voice booming across the room. He didn't even look at the man. "Ethan is here at my personal invitation. He is acting as my designated financial consultant for the duration of this meeting." Julian let out a loud, forced laugh, trying desperately to regain control of the room. He looked at me with pure, unfiltered condescension. A financial consultant? Really, Marcus? Elena already told me what this is about. Ethan is broke. He is here to beg for a severance package, or threaten a pathetic lawsuit for unpaid salary. Ethan, this is a board meeting, not a family therapy session. You need to leave before I have you physically dragged out. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I walked slowly to the only empty chair at the opposite end of the table, the exact same chair I sat in on the day they fired me. I placed my heavy leather briefcase on the polished wood. I looked directly into Julian's eyes, and then shifted my gaze to my father. I am not here for a salary, I said, my voice dangerously calm, cutting through the tension like a razor blade. I am not here to sue you, and I am certainly not here to beg. I am here to explain exactly why this company is bleeding to death, and I am here to show the board exactly where the money went. Julian's forced smile vanished entirely. The trap had slammed shut, and they were finally looking at the teeth. You have absolutely nothing to show, Julian sneered, though I could hear the faint microscopic tremble in his voice. He glanced nervously at my father, who was sitting perfectly rigid, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests of his chair. You are a bitter, fired employee trying to cause a scene because you couldn't handle the pressure of a real promotion. I unlatched the heavy brass locks on my briefcase. The sharp click-clack echoed loudly in the silent room. I pulled out the 6 thick black binders and slid them firmly across the polished mahogany table. One stopped in front of Marcus. One stopped in front of Mr. Vance, the oldest and most ruthless member of the board. I made sure the thickest binder slid directly in front of my father. Open them, I commanded. I didn't ask. I didn't suggest. I ordered them. Mr. Vance, a man who had survived 3 corporate mergers and had 0 patience for family drama, flipped his binder open to the first tab. He adjusted his reading glasses. What you are looking at, I said, pacing slowly behind my chair, is a complete, unredacted forensic audit of Blackwood Distribution's accounts payable for the last 14 months. Specifically, the contractor disbursement accounts. Julian stood up abruptly, his chair screeching violently against the hardwood floor. This is highly illegal. You hacked into our secure servers. Richard, do not let them look at that. It is fabricated nonsense. He is trying to frame me. Sit down and shut your mouth, Julian, Mr. Vance snapped, without even looking up from the pages. The sheer authority in the old man's voice made Julian freeze. He slowly sank back into his chair, his breathing shallow and rapid. Turn to page 12, I instructed the room. I watched as the board members simultaneously flipped the heavy paper. You will see a detailed ledger of payments made to 3 companies, Crescent Holdings, Vanguard Solutions, and Apex Consulting. Over the past year, Blackwood Distribution has paid exactly $585,000 to these entities. Derek, the loyalist, scoffed. So what? We use outside logistics consultants all the time. That is standard operating procedure. It would be, I replied coldly, if those companies actually existed. But if you turn to page 14, you will see the state registry searches. There are no corporate offices. There are no employees. There are no shipping manifests or service logs. They are phantom shell companies. But more importantly, look at the bank routing numbers. The room was so quiet. I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. The funds did not go to domestic vendor accounts, I continued, my voice steady and relentless. The money was systematically wired directly into offshore trusts located in the Cayman Islands. This is not corporate mismanagement, gentlemen. This is highly coordinated federal-level embezzlement. A collective gasp rippled through the board members. Marcus looked at me, a grim smile playing on his lips. Mr. Vance's face turned completely red with absolute fury. Julian was panicking now. His face was covered in a sheer layer of sweat. He looked at the board, holding his hands up defensively. He is lying. He manipulated the digital records. I don't know anything about the Cayman Islands. This is insane. I reached into my suit jacket and pulled out a single high-resolution photograph. I tossed it onto the center of the table. It was a picture of the gleaming silver Porsche parked downstairs. "Turn to page 22, I said, never taking my eyes off Julian. Last month, a wire transfer of $50,000 was sent to Crescent Holdings. 48 hours later, $45,000 was wired from that exact Cayman account back to a luxury car dealership in Miami. It paid for the custom Porsche 911 currently sitting in the CEO's reserved parking space downstairs. You bought a luxury sports car with stolen vendor funds while our real estate partners were threatening lawsuits for unpaid invoices." "You son of a," Julian hissed, standing up again, his fists clenched. "You think you can just walk in here and ruin my life? You have always been jealous of me. You are nothing." "I am the man holding the receipts," I fired back, my voice echoing like a gunshot. I didn't back down. I didn't raise my pitch. I crushed him with absolute terrifying calm. "But don't worry, Julian. I know you aren't smart enough to set up an offshore shell corporation by yourself. You don't even know how to convert a PDF. Which brings me to the final section of the binder. Turn to page 30. This was it. The absolute climax. The moment I had been waiting for my entire life. I looked directly at my father. Richard Blackwood was staring down at the open binder in front of him. He looked like a man standing on the gallows watching the executioner reach for the lever. "Julian's signature is on every single internal request for those wire transfers," I told the silent, horrified room. "But as CEO, Julian's discretionary spending limit is capped at $25,000. He physically could not authorize those massive offshore transfers alone. The bank requires a secondary executive signature for anything over the limit." Mr. Vance flipped to page 30. He stared at the documents, his mouth slightly open. He looked up, his eyes locking onto my father with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Every single one of those fraudulent offshore transfers," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "was manually countersigned by the chairman of the board. My father, Richard Blackwood." The silence shattered. The room exploded into chaos. Derek dropped his pen, staring at my father in complete horror. Mr. Vance slammed his fist onto the table so hard his coffee cup rattled. "Richard!" Mr. Vance roared. "Is this true? You signed off on stealing $500,000 from your own shareholders to fund this idiot sports cars?" My father finally looked up. The arrogant, untouchable patriarch was gone. He looked old. He looked small. He looked utterly terrified. He opened his mouth, desperately trying to find the manipulation, the spin, the lie that would save him. I didn't know the extent of it," my father stammered, his voice cracking. He pointed a shaking finger at Julian. "Julian told me they were critical consulting fees. He said we needed the offshore tax advantages. I trusted my son. I didn't look closely at the paperwork. I am innocent." "Do not play the victim, Richard," Marcus intervened, his voice dripping with venom. "You are the most micromanaging CEO in the history of the state. You don't authorize a $10 lunch receipt without reading the fine print. You knew exactly what you were doing. You robbed us to protect your golden boy." Julian stared at our father, absolute betrayal flashing across his face. "You are throwing me under the bus. You told me to set up the accounts. You said it was my early inheritance." The word inheritance hung in the air like toxic gas. They were tearing each other apart. The unbreakable bond of the golden child and the devoted father was disintegrating under the pressure of federal prison. Mr. Vance stood up, towering over the table. "I have heard absolutely enough. As the senior member of this board, I am calling for an immediate vote. I move to terminate Julian Blackwood as Chief Executive Officer effective this exact second for gross financial misconduct and fraud. Furthermore, I moved to permanently strip Richard Blackwood of his title as chairman and suspend all his corporate access pending a full federal investigation. The vote didn't even take 30 seconds. It was unanimous. Even Derek, the loyalist, raised his hand to fire them. He knew the ship was at the bottom of the ocean, and he wasn't going to drown with it. Julian collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He was hyperventilating, the reality of his ruined life finally crashing down on his shoulders. I closed my empty briefcase and clicked the brass lock shut. I had done exactly what I came to do. I didn't scream. I didn't demand an apology. I just exposed the rot to the sunlight. As I turned to walk out of the room, my father stood up. He walked around the table, his eyes filled with a pathetic, desperate pleading I had never seen before. He reached out and grabbed my arm. "Ethan, please," he whispered, his voice cracking with tears. "You have to pull those binders. We can fix this internally. We can pay the money back. I am your father. You cannot send your own flesh and blood to federal prison. Think about your mother. Think about the family." I looked down at his hand, gripping my suit sleeve. Then I looked up into his terrified, tear-filled eyes. I thought about the 14-year-old boy whose laptop was stolen. I thought about the college fund that was denied. I thought about the endless, exhausting nights in the warehouse, entirely unappreciated. "Walk away," I said, my voice cold, hollow, and absolutely final. "Walk away if you do not like it." I pulled my arm out of his grasp, turned my back on the Blackwood Empire, and walked out the door. Let's pause for a moment. Thank you for staying with me this far. You're truly amazing. Please help me by liking the video and commenting the number 1 below so I know you've been here with me until this point. This not only helps more people discover this story, but also lets me know that my experiences mean something to someone. Your support is the greatest motivation for me to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The immediate aftermath of that boardroom meeting was a spectacle of absolute destruction. I did not stay in the building to watch them pack their boxes. I walked out to my car, got in, and drove back to my own warehouse at Apex Logistics. I felt a strange, profound lightness in my chest. The heavy, suffocating anchor I had been dragging behind me for 28 years had finally been cut loose. But I didn't need to be in the building to know what happened next. Sarah, the lead accountant who had originally tipped me off, kept me thoroughly updated via text messages throughout the week. Apparently, the moment I left the room, Julian threw a massive, unhinged tantrum. He started throwing coffee mugs against the frosted glass walls, screaming that the board was ungrateful, that he was the victim of a massive corporate conspiracy, and demanding they call his lawyer. Mr. Vance did not tolerate Julian's meltdown for a single second. Building security escorted Julian out of the executive suite in front of the entire administrative staff, while Elena, the assistant who had tried to betray Ethan, hid under her desk. Richard's exit was quieter but far more humiliating. The board forced him to sign an immediate resignation letter, forfeiting his severance package and remaining stock options to help cover the stolen funds. He walked out of the building he had built, carrying a single cardboard box, looking broken, defeated, and suddenly very old. But losing their jobs was only the beginning. Because the stolen money had moved through interstate wire transfers and offshore accounts, the case became a federal crime. Marcus and Mr. Vance were legally required to report everything, and 1 week later, IRS criminal investigators and FBI financial crimes agents raided Blackwood Distribution. They seized computers, hard drives, filing cabinets, and servers. A tow truck arrived the same day and took Julian's custom silver Porsche as a criminal asset, while Julian screamed uselessly in the rain. His bank accounts were frozen, his credit cards collapsed, his rich friends abandoned him, and he was forced to move back into his parents' house. Richard, once obsessed with reputation and control, became a corporate disgrace, facing felony charges for wire fraud and conspiracy. To afford a defense lawyer, he had to take a second mortgage on the family estate, and the fear of real prison time aged him almost overnight. Meanwhile, Apex Logistics exploded. Marcus moved his real estate distribution contracts to Ethan's company, and other vendors quickly followed, desperate to escape the chaos surrounding Blackwood. Within a year, Ethan opened a second warehouse and promoted Liam to vice president of operations, giving him the respect and salary that hard-working people deserved. Ethan built a company based on loyalty, transparency, and competence, proving that he never needed the Blackwood name to succeed. But one final tether remained. 8 months after the boardroom confrontation, Victoria appeared at Ethan's office without an appointment, crying in the lobby and refusing to leave. When Ethan let her in, she begged him to call Marcus, the board, and the authorities to stop the federal case. She said Richard was suffering heart problems from the stress, the lawyers were draining their retirement, and Julian might face 5 to 7 years in federal prison. She pleaded with Ethan to save them for the sake of family. Ethan calmly told her he could not drop federal charges because he was not the Department of Justice. Then Victoria's mask slipped. She blamed Ethan, saying none of this would have happened if he had brought the evidence to them privately. Ethan asked when she had learned about the Cayman Islands accounts, and her silence gave him the answer. She had known. Then, she finally admitted what she truly believed. Julian was struggling. Julian needed a cushion, and the stolen money was simply his early inheritance. In her mind, Ethan had always landed on his feet, while Julian deserved to be protected, no matter who had to be sacrificed. That was the final truth Ethan needed. He told her to get out. He told her she was not a mother, but an enabler who had allowed Richard to abuse him, Julian to steal from him, and the entire family to bury him. He said he had no mother, no father, and no brother, because they were all dead to him. Victoria left the office completely shattered, finally understanding that the obedient son she had manipulated for decades was gone forever. Later that night, Ethan found the old spiral notebook where he had written the words, "Build, don't beg," during the darkest night of his life. He held it for a moment and realized he no longer needed it as a reminder. He was not building Apex out of revenge anymore. The revenge had already been completed. The karma had already collected its debt. Now he was building for himself. He threw the notebook away, turned off the lights, and finally let the past stay buried. Ethan survived the Blackwood family by learning the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes the most toxic people in your life are the ones who share your last name. He owed them no loyalty simply because they shared his blood. Walking away was not weakness. It was the ultimate declaration of his own worth.